Have you ever walked into a room and immediately noticed someone who wasn't trying to be noticed? They weren't the loudest. They weren't the most attractive. They weren't speaking the most. Yet somehow, everyone seemed aware of them. People looked at them longer than necessary. Conversations subtly shifted around them. Even silence felt different in their presence. Now ask yourself a difficult question. Have you ever wondered why that happens? Most people spend years trying to become more interesting. They learn communication techniques. They imitate confidence. They memorize social skills. They carefully build an image they hope others will admire. Yet the harder they try, the more invisible they become. Meanwhile, someone else walks into the same room with no apparent effort and instantly commands attention. What separates these two people? Most would say confidence. Others would say beauty. Some would call it charisma. Carl Jung believed the answer was much deeper. Because what truly attracts people isn't something you perform, it is something you become. There's a hidden force inside every human being that others can feel long before a single word is spoken. A force created not by perfection, but by psychological integration. The tragedy is that almost nobody develops it. Instead, we spend our entire lives polishing the mask we present to the world. We smile when we feel empty. We seek approval when we crave acceptance. We shape our personalities around expectations instead of truth. Little by little, we become experts at acting while forgetting who we really are. Ironically, the more convincing the performance becomes, the weaker our presence grows. Because people may admire a performance, but they are drawn to authenticity. And authenticity cannot be faked. It can only emerge after something uncomfortable happens. You must stop chasing attention. Stop chasing validation. Stop chasing the impossible task of controlling how other people perceive you. The moment that need disappears, something extraordinary begins to happen. Your words carry more weight. Your silence becomes meaningful. Your gaze becomes steady. Your decisions become calmer. People begin to sense something different about you without understanding why. This isn't manipulation. It isn't a social trick. It isn't body language. It is psychology. Jung called it the journey toward individuation, the slow process of becoming psychologically whole. And strangely enough, the people who complete this journey rarely care about being liked anymore. That is precisely why they become unforgettable. Throughout this video, you'll discover why some individuals seem naturally magnetic without making any effort, why others spend their entire lives trying to earn attention they never truly receive, and how a few invisible psychological shifts can completely transform the way people experience your presence. But before we explore those changes, we must understand the greatest misunderstanding about magnetism, because almost everything society teaches about attraction is backwards, and until that illusion collapses, real presence will remain impossible. Chapter 2. The biggest lie about charisma. Society has spent decades convincing you that magnetism is something you can manufacture. Buy the right clothes, learn the perfect posture, master eye contact, speak with confidence, smile at the right moment, remember people's names. While none of these things are useless, they all suffer from the same fatal flaw. They only change what people see. They never change what people feel. And human beings are far more sensitive than they realize. Long before the conscious mind forms an opinion, the unconscious has already reached a conclusion. You have experienced this yourself. Sometimes you meet someone who says all the right things. They smile. They compliment you. They appear confident. Yet something inside you quietly whispers, I don't trust this person. You cannot explain it. There is no evidence, no obvious reason. Still, you feel it. Now consider the opposite. Occasionally, you meet someone who barely speaks. They never try to impress anyone. They don't dominate conversations. Yet after only a few minutes, you feel strangely comfortable around them. Again, there is no logical explanation, only a feeling. Carl Jung believed that beneath every conversation, another conversation is always taking place. Not between words, but between psyches, between unconscious minds. Every person carries an invisible psychological atmosphere, an emotional climate, a silent language that cannot be rehearsed. This is why authenticity has such extraordinary power. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately noticed someone who wasn't trying to be noticed? They weren't the loudest. They weren't the most attractive. They weren't speaking the most. Yet somehow, everyone seemed aware of them. People looked at them longer than necessary. Conversations subtly shifted around them. Even silence felt different in their presence. Now ask yourself a difficult question. Have you ever wondered why that happens? Most people spend years trying to become more interesting. They learn communication techniques. They imitate confidence. They memorize social skills. They carefully build an image they hope others will admire. Yet the harder they try, the more invisible they become. Meanwhile, someone else walks into the same room with no apparent effort and instantly commands attention. What separates these two people? Most would say confidence. Others would say beauty. Some would call it charisma. Carl Jung believed the answer was much deeper. Because what truly attracts people isn't something you perform. It is something you become. There's a hidden force inside every human being that others can feel long before a single word is spoken. A force created not by perfection, but by psychological integration. The tragedy is that almost nobody develops it. Instead, we spend our entire lives polishing the mask we present to the world. We smile when we feel empty. We seek approval when we crave acceptance. We shape our personalities around expectations instead of truth. Little by little, we become experts at acting while forgetting who we really are. Ironically, the more convincing the performance becomes, the weaker our presence grows. Because people may admire a performance, but they are drawn to authenticity. And authenticity cannot be faked. It can only emerge after something uncomfortable happens. You must stop chasing attention. Stop chasing validation. Stop chasing the impossible task of controlling how other people perceive you. The moment that need disappears, something extraordinary begins to happen. Your words carry more weight. Your silence becomes meaningful. Your gaze becomes steady. Your decisions become calmer. People begin to sense something different about you without understanding why. This isn't manipulation. It isn't a social trick. It isn't body language. It is psychology. Jung called it the journey toward individuation, the slow process of becoming psychologically whole. And strangely enough, the people who complete this journey rarely care about being liked anymore. That is precisely why they become unforgettable. Throughout this video, you'll discover why some individuals seem naturally magnetic without making any effort, why others spend their entire lives trying to earn attention they never truly receive, and how a few invisible psychological shifts can completely transform the way people experience your presence. But before we explore those changes, we must understand the greatest misunderstanding about magnetism, because almost everything society teaches about attraction is backwards, and until that illusion collapses, real presence will remain impossible. Chapter 2. The biggest lie about charisma. Society has spent decades convincing you that magnetism is something you can manufacture. Buy the right clothes, learn the perfect posture, master eye contact, speak with confidence, smile at the right moment, remember people's names. While none of these things are useless, they all suffer from the same fatal flaw. They only change what people see. They never change what people feel. And human beings are far more sensitive than they realize. Long before the conscious mind forms an opinion, the unconscious has already reached a conclusion. You have experienced this yourself. Sometimes you meet someone who says all the right things. They smile. They compliment you. They appear confident. Yet something inside you quietly whispers, "I don't trust this person." You cannot explain it. There is no evidence, no obvious reason. Still, you feel it. Now consider the opposite. Occasionally you meet someone who barely speaks. They never try to impress anyone. They don't dominate conversations. Yet after only a few minutes, you feel strangely comfortable around them. Again, there is no logical explanation, only a feeling. Carl Jung believed that beneath every conversation, another conversation is always taking place. Not between words, but between psyches, between unconscious minds. Every person carries an invisible psychological atmosphere, an emotional climate, a silent language that cannot be rehearsed. This is why authenticity has such extraordinary power. Jung called this character the persona. The persona is not evil. In fact, every healthy human being needs one. It allows us to function in society, to work, to cooperate, to adapt. The danger begins when the mask becomes stronger than the person wearing it. Slowly, the performance replaces the identity. You stop asking, "Who am I?" and begin asking, "Who do people want me to be?" Without noticing, your entire personality becomes a negotiation. You laugh when you don't find something funny. You apologize for things that require no apology. You hide opinions. You suppress emotions. You edit your words before speaking. Not because they are false, but because you fear losing approval. The strange part is that this strategy often works. At first, people like you. They praise you. They accept you. But deep inside, something feels increasingly empty. Because the version receiving love is not the real you. It is the character you created to survive. The unconscious knows this, and so does everyone else's unconscious. They may not consciously recognize the performance, but they feel its tension. This is why some people seem pleasant, yet completely forgettable. There is nothing stable beneath the performance. No psychological center. No quiet certainty. Only adaptation. Real magnetism begins where performance ends. It begins the moment you no longer need every interaction to confirm your worth. Think about the people you admire most, the truly unforgettable ones. Were they constantly trying to prove themselves? Or did they simply exist with a calm certainty that required no advertisement? Confidence is loud only when it is fragile. Real confidence rarely announces itself. It doesn't compete. It doesn't chase. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It simply occupies space naturally. Jung observed that psychological wholeness creates an unusual effect. The more integrated a person becomes internally, the less energy they spend managing external impressions. Instead of asking, "How do I look?" their attention shifts toward a more meaningful question. Am I living in alignment with who I really am? That single shift changes everything. Because attention follows congruence. Not perfection, congruence. When your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, and your values begin moving in the same direction, people feel something that is increasingly rare in the modern world. Consistency. And consistency creates trust. Trust creates respect. Respect creates presence. Presence becomes magnetism. But there is still one obstacle that prevents most people from reaching this state. It is older than childhood, more powerful than fear, and invisible to almost everyone. Jung called it the shadow. And until you understand how the shadow secretly controls your behavior, you will continue chasing a version of yourself that never truly existed. There's an addiction that almost no one recognizes. It doesn't involve alcohol. It doesn't involve money. It doesn't involve drugs. Yet it quietly controls millions of lives every single day. The addiction to approval. Unlike other addictions, this one is often rewarded. People call you kind, helpful, selfless, easy to be around. But beneath those compliments, something dangerous is happening. Your identity is slowly being outsourced. Instead of asking yourself what you believe, you begin watching other people's reactions before deciding who you should become. Without realizing it, your emotional state starts depending on invisible votes. A compliment makes you feel valuable. Silence makes you feel rejected. Criticism feels like a personal attack, and disapproval becomes almost unbearable. At first, this seems normal. After all, human beings are social creatures. We all want acceptance. We all long to belong. Carl Jung never suggested eliminating this desire. He understood it as part of our nature. But he also warned about something far more dangerous. The moment belonging becomes more important than truth, the self begins to disappear. Think about how many decisions people make every day that have nothing to do with their real desires. They choose careers to impress their families, relationships to avoid loneliness, opinions to fit into groups, dreams that someone else wrote for them. Little by little, they become strangers to themselves. And the tragedy is that the world often applauds this transformation. Because obedient people are predictable. Predictable people are easy to influence, easy to sell to, easy to manipulate, easy to control. But something extraordinary happens the day you stop asking for permission to exist. You stop chasing approval. You stop explaining every decision. You stop defending every boundary. You stop apologizing simply because someone became uncomfortable with your growth. At first, people notice. Some become confused. Others become irritated. A few even accuse you of changing. They're right. You are changing, not into someone colder, into someone more whole. This is where many people make a terrible mistake. They believe becoming authentic means becoming rude. They mistake honesty for aggression, boundaries for arrogance, detachment for superiority. That isn't individuation. That is simply another mask. True psychological maturity is remarkably quiet. It doesn't need to humiliate anyone. It doesn't need to prove intelligence. It doesn't seek revenge. It simply refuses to betray itself. Imagine carrying a bucket filled with water everywhere you go. Every criticism removes a little. Every rejection spills a little more. Every attempt to impress someone empties it further. Eventually, there's almost nothing left. This is how psychological exhaustion begins. Not through dramatic trauma, but through thousands of tiny moments where you abandoned yourself to gain acceptance. Jung believed psychic energy was limited. Every unnecessary emotional battle cost something. Every forced smile, every fake agreement, every relationship maintained out of fear, every version of yourself created just to keep someone else comfortable. The cost is invisible until one day you wake up feeling strangely empty. Not because life became harder, because you have been giving pieces of yourself away for years. The fascinating part is this. People often become far more attractive after they stop trying to be attractive. Why? Because attention is no longer their objective. Presence becomes their objective. There is enormous freedom in realizing that not everyone has to understand you. Not everyone has to like you. Not everyone has to stay. The need to be universally accepted is impossible to satisfy. And anything impossible eventually becomes exhausting. The people with the strongest presence understand something most of us spend decades avoiding. Rejection is not always a loss. Sometimes, it is evidence that your life is finally becoming honest. Every time someone walks away because you stop pretending, you create space for relationships built on reality instead of performance. This is why authentic people often have fewer relationships, but deeper ones. They stop collecting approval and begin attracting alignment. That shift changes everything, because from this point forward, people are no longer responding to your performance. They are responding to your essence. And once that begins to happen, another remarkable transformation quietly unfolds. You stop chasing attention and start commanding it without effort. But to understand why, we first need to explore one of Jung's most misunderstood ideas, the mysterious power of psychological presence. Have you ever noticed that some people completely change the atmosphere of a room without saying a single word? They don't interrupt conversations. They don't demand attention. They don't perform confidence. Yet everyone becomes subtly aware that they are there. It's almost impossible to explain, but almost everyone has experienced it. Modern psychology often tries to explain this phenomenon through body language. Eye contact, posture, voice, facial expressions. These elements certainly matter, but they are only the surface. Carl Jung believed something much deeper was taking place. He understood that every human being projects an invisible psychological field, not through mystical forces, but through the unconscious. Your unconscious is constantly communicating, even when your mouth remains closed. Think about the last time you met someone who seemed deeply at peace. You probably relaxed without knowing why. Nothing extraordinary happened. No inspiring speech. No impressive story. Just their presence. Now remember someone who looked confident on the outside, but somehow made you anxious. Again, nothing obvious happened. yet your body sends something your conscious mind couldn't explain. This is the language of the unconscious. Human beings are remarkably skilled at detecting internal contradiction. When someone's words say, "I'm fine," but their entire psychological state screams, "I'm terrified," people feel the inconsistency. Perhaps they cannot explain it, but they trust it. This is why presence cannot be learned like a social technique. It is the natural consequence of internal alignment. Presence is what remains when inner conflict begins to disappear. Unfortunately, most people spend years trying to improve the wrong thing. They improve appearance, vocabulary, status, clothing, social media, networking. Meanwhile, their inner world remains fragmented. Their thoughts move in one direction, their emotions in another, their actions somewhere else entirely. The result is invisible tension, a tension other people quietly perceive. Jung observed that psychological energy naturally seeks coherence. When the conscious mind and the unconscious move against each other, the individual experiences constant internal resistance. That resistance leaks into every interaction, into every decision, into every conversation. People call it insecurity, but insecurity is only the symptom. The real problem is inner division. Imagine trying to drive a car while one foot presses the accelerator and the other presses the brake. The engine works harder. Fuel disappears faster. The journey becomes exhausting, yet the car barely moves. This is exactly how many people live. One part of them wants freedom. Another fears rejection. One part wants authenticity. Another wants approval. One part wants peace. Another remains addicted to emotional chaos. No amount of confidence techniques can solve this contradiction, because the conflict is internal, and whatever remains unresolved inside will eventually appear outside. This explains something fascinating. Why do some people seem effortlessly calm during situations that overwhelm everyone else? Because they are no longer fighting themselves. They have made peace with emotions they once feared. They no longer panic every time anxiety appears. They no longer hate themselves for feeling insecure. They no longer believe fear is proof of weakness. Instead, they observe, they breathe, they respond, rather than react. That simple difference transforms everything. Reaction is unconscious. Response is conscious. Reaction is automatic. Response is intentional. Reaction gives your power away. Response keeps it. Every emotionally mature person has discovered this secret. Between what happens and how you answer it, there's always a space. Most people never notice it. They become anger. They become fear. They become embarrassment. Integrated people step into that space. And inside it, they choose. That choice is invisible. Yet everyone around them feels its effects. Because emotional stability creates psychological gravity. People trust those who trust themselves. Not because they appear perfect, but because they appear real. This is why truly magnetic individuals rarely dominate conversations. They don't need constant attention to confirm their existence. Silence doesn't frighten them. Being misunderstood doesn't destroy them. Waiting doesn't make them anxious. They have stopped measuring their value through external reactions. Instead, their attention moves inward, toward character, toward discipline, toward truth. And that changes the energy they bring into every room. Ironically, the less they try to influence people, the more influence they naturally possess. Because genuine influence is never forced. It is recognized. There's an old illusion that power comes from controlling others. Jung suggested something entirely different. Real power begins the moment you stop needing control at all. And perhaps nowhere is that transformation more visible than in the way you handle silence. Because silence is not empty. Silence reveals who still depends on noise. In the next chapter, you'll discover why silence is one of the strongest psychological signals a human being can send. There's a reason silence makes so many people uncomfortable. Not because silence is empty, but because it removes every distraction. The moment words disappear, truth becomes impossible to escape. Most people spend their lives surrounded by noise. Notifications, opinions, arguments, entertainment, constant stimulation, not because they enjoy it, but because silence forces them to confront something they have spent years avoiding themselves. Carl Jung believed that every journey towards psychological wholeness eventually passes through solitude, not loneliness. Solitude. There is a profound difference. Loneliness says, I am incomplete without someone else. Solitude whispers, for the first time, I can finally hear myself. Most people never reach that moment. The instant silence begins. They search for another conversation, another relationship, another distraction, anything to avoid the uncomfortable encounter with their own mind. Yet something extraordinary happens to those who remain. At first, the silence feels unbearable. Old memories return. Regrets appear. Embarrassing moments replay themselves over and over again. You begin hearing thoughts you didn't know existed. For many people, this is where they run away. But those who stay discover something remarkable. The mind slowly becomes quieter. Not because problems disappear, but because resistance begins to disappear. Jung often described individuation as a return, not toward becoming someone new, but toward remembering who you were before the world told you who you needed to become. That return cannot happen in constant noise. It requires silence. Imagine a lake during a storm. The water is chaotic. Waves crash in every direction. Nothing beneath the surface can be seen. Now imagine that same lake after hours of complete stillness. The water becomes transparent. What was always there finally becomes visible. Your mind works the same way. When you constantly react, constantly explain yourself, constantly seek approval, your psychological waters never become still. You cannot see your true motivations. You cannot recognize unconscious fears. You cannot distinguish intuition from anxiety. Everything becomes mixed together. Silence separates them. This is why emotionally mature people are rarely impulsive. They have learned to wait, to observe, to let emotions settle before making decisions. Because they understand something most people never realize. The first feeling is not always the deepest truth. Sometimes anger hides sadness. Sometimes jealousy hides insecurity. Sometimes anxiety hides the fear of rejection. Sometimes ambition hides the desperate need to feel worthy. Only silence reveals what emotion is truly trying to say. The world teaches immediate reaction. Jung taught conscious observation. Those are two completely different ways of living. Reaction belongs to the unconscious. Observation belongs to awareness. And awareness changes everything. Think about the strongest people you have ever met. Not the loudest, not the richest, not the most famous. The strongest. Chances are, they didn't waste words. They listened more than they spoke. They answered slowly. They rarely defended themselves. They didn't need every misunderstanding to be corrected. They understood a simple truth. Not every opinion deserves a response. Not every criticism deserves your energy. Not every conflict deserves your presence. That realization is incredibly liberating because every unnecessary argument steals a piece of your attention. And attention is your most valuable psychological resource. Where your attention goes, your life follows. If your attention belongs to people who misunderstand you, your peace belongs to them as well. If your attention belongs to criticism, your emotions become controlled by strangers. If your attention belongs to endless comparison, your identity slowly disappears. Silence takes that attention back. Little by little, it returns your energy to its rightful owner. You. This is why truly magnetic people never seem desperate. Not because life is easier for them, but because they no longer waste themselves trying to convince people who have already decided not to understand them. There is enormous freedom in accepting that misunderstanding is part of authenticity. The moment you stop trying to control every opinion, you become emotionally untouchable. And paradoxically, that is the exact moment people begin to notice you differently. Not because you became louder, but because you finally became real. However, there is one final transformation that separates someone who simply protects their peace from someone whose presence becomes unforgettable. is the moment they stop searching for magnetism and become the kind of person who naturally creates it. That is where our journey ends and where your real one begins. There is a quiet moment in every person's life, a moment almost invisible, when they realize they have spent years trying to become someone worthy of being loved. Not because they were broken, not because they lacked value, but because somewhere along the way, they began believing that love had to be earned. So they performed. They adapted. They smiled when they wanted to cry. They stayed silent when they wanted to speak. They accepted less than they deserved because losing themselves seemed less frightening than losing other people. Perhaps you know exactly what that feels like. Perhaps you've spent years chasing recognition, trying to become more interesting, more attractive, more successful, hoping that one day someone would finally see your worth. But what if that day never comes? What if the life you've been waiting for begins only after you stop waiting for permission to live it? Carl Jung believed that every human being carries within themselves an image of who they could become. Not the version created by fear, not the version shaped by expectations, but the authentic self, the deepest center of the personality, the part that exists long before applause, long before rejection, long before the world tells you who you should be. Most people never meet that self. They spend their entire lives protecting the persona, defending an identity built for survival. And although that identity may bring acceptance, it rarely brings peace. Real transformation begins the day you become more interested in knowing yourself than in being understood by everyone else. That single decision changes the direction of your life, because when you finally stop performing, you discover something extraordinary. You have nothing left to prove. You stop measuring your worth through compliments. You stop questioning your value because someone walked away. You stop shrinking yourself to make insecure people comfortable. For the first time, your peace becomes independent of other people's opinions. That is freedom. And freedom has a presence that cannot be imitated. People notice it, not because you're trying to stand out, but because authenticity is becoming increasingly rare. In a world where almost everyone is performing, the person who is genuinely at peace becomes unforgettable. Not louder, not more dramatic, simply more real. That is the paradox. The people who desperately seek attention often receive the least of it. The people who stop needing attention often become impossible to ignore, not because they discovered a secret technique, but because they stopped abandoning themselves. There is a quiet confidence that appears when you no longer fear rejection, a calm strength that emerges when you no longer depend on approval, a steady presence that grows when your inner world becomes more important than your public image. And perhaps this is what magnetism has always been, not the ability to attract everyone, but the courage to remain yourself, even when doing so costs you comfort, approval, or certainty. Because every time you choose authenticity over performance, you recover another piece of yourself. Every honest decision strengthens your character. Every healthy boundary restores your energy. Every moment of silence reconnects you with something deeper than confidence. It reconnects you with truth. The truth that your value has never depended on applause. The truth that your presence does not need permission. The truth that becoming unforgettable is never about convincing the world to notice you. It is about becoming someone you no longer need to escape from. Perhaps that is why Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who others expect, not who fear demands, not who the world rewards, but who you are when nothing is left to prove." So before you leave, ask yourself one final question. If no one else's opinion could define your future, who would you become tomorrow? Sit with that question. Don't answer it too quickly. Some questions are not meant to be solved immediately. They are meant to transform you slowly. And perhaps that transformation has already begun. Ending CTA. If this message resonated with you, write in the comments. I choose authenticity. I'd love to know how many people are ready to stop performing and begin living from their true self. If you enjoyed this journey into Carl Jung psychology, subscribe to The Kingdom Within, where we explore the hidden forces that shape the human mind, the shadow, individuation, and the path toward genuine inner freedom. And if you're ready to continue this journey, the next video is waiting for you. Because understanding yourself is not a destination. It's a lifelong adventure. I'll see you there.